Good. Okay, yeah, we can get started here. Happy Halloween, everybody. We have the very the spooky topic of animal domestication and property rights tonight. It's like, well, it can be spooky for some economists, a nebulous, non-mathematical term, property rights. But I will go ahead and introduce the speaker for this evening. So we have Dr. Dean Lueck, Professor of Economics and Affiliate Professor of Law at Indiana University. He's also Director of the Program on Governance of Natural Resources at the Ostrom Workshop. Dr. Lueck's areas of research are the economics of contracts and property rights, economic organization, law and econ, and environmental natural resource econ. He has authored numerous publications in professional journals, books, and other outlets. He's the co-author of The Nature of the Farm and a contributing co-editor of Wildfire Policy, Law, and Econ Perspectives. Dr. Lueck holds memberships in the American Economic Association, the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, the American Law and Economics Association, and the Society for Institutional and Organizational Economics. And prior to his academic career, I found this interesting, Dr. Lueck was a smoke jumper with the U.S. Forest Service in McCall, Idaho. His favorite economists are Alchian, Coase, and Dimsets. Please welcome Dr. Lueck.
Thank you, Alex. It's great to be here, and nice to get to know some of you this evening before the lecture as well. Somebody asked me today if I am a domestication economist, and there's no such thing really. This is what I'm going to talk to you about is a topic in which I've got some ongoing work, including one publication, and it has a mix of law and economics and economic history, ancient economic history, natural resource economics, and a little anthropology thrown in. I hope I have my phone shut off here. Let me just make sure I do that. And what I've started with here is a quote from Sir Francis Galton, who is famous for lots of things, including, I found it today, he's a cousin of Charles Darwin. But he wrote about domestication. He also, I think, was one of the first people to sort of develop the idea of correlation in statistics. And he has this idea here, what it takes to domesticate wild creatures, if you will. Now, let's see. How do I need to hit some links. Do I need to get the, I think I need to grab that. So let's see if that works. Now, I'm left-handed, which is going to screw up the mouse, but let's see if we can get it here. Should have planned for this a little bit better. Let's see. I want to hit this. There we are. Okay, so I want to show you some pictures of the same species. So Canis lupus. Some people think of wolves, and other people think of very small toy poodles. Same species. Bos taurus. There you see on the left, that's what we believe to be the wild ancestor, sometimes called the auroch, and there's a Holstein. Ranger ferturandus, which is known as caribou in North America, known as reindeer in Europe. Now you might be noticing size and shape differences here, I hope. Ovis orientalis, a wild sheep, and then there's a, what is that? I can't remember. Do you know Charles know the name of that particular breed? I think it's it's not Rambouillet, but not sure. Wild boar, Sus scrofa, domestic pig. And one of my last favorite one is Homo sapiens. And here we have the hunter-gatherers, and then we have a old-fashioned farmer, and then we have modern hipster, I guess is what we call that. The point here is same species, but very different behavior and morphology, and even biology if you go deeper. Let's try to go back here. There we go. So that you get the stage set. So the basic question is, how did this possibly happen, and why would it happen, and how can economists think about it? This talk is based on work with Gustavo Torrens, colleague of mine at IU, and we have one little published paper in the Journal of Institutional Economics. We've got a couple projects related to this, and I'll kind of be touching on pieces of all of it today as well. So let's just kind of summarize what I'm going to try to do here. First, I'm going to use the property rights approach and blend it with some renewable resource theory, a little bit of evolutionary economics to examine this question of how did animals come to be domesticated? Why are they domesticated? Why would you do that to that beautiful wild boar and then turn it into that pink hairless thing? Wild animals are governed basically by weak property rights, both to the stocks, populations, and then to individuals. While domesticated animals, on the other hand, and there's a lot of literature in the law on this, which is useful too to think about at some point, are governed by private ownerships of stocks and individuals. The way we want to think about this, the way I want to get you to think about it, is a kind of a conversion of wild populations into private property, essentially, as well as a transition from natural selection. So those caribou, wolves can play a dual role. Those caribou, they're hunted by, well, humans too, but wolves in general, and so they're subject to all these natural forces by the predators and by weather and other natural forces. Once they become owned, they're subject in large part to selection pressures by the owners, which can depend on market forces and other things, if you will. And in our framework, which actually is consistent with Sir Francis Galton, the domestication is not the goal of anybody, really. It is an outcome of a kind of an evolutionary process in which an economic agent, tries to maximize its rent, if you will, from some potential resource stock that it faces, starting from a hunter-gatherer society. Okay, and the model we have anyway suggests this process kind of moves slowly at first, and then proceeds rather rapidly, and that's roughly consistent with my understanding, at least, of the archaeological evidence, which is, of course, changing, kind of as we speak. And then to get you thinking a little more deeply here, maybe, domestication, I won't say cause, of course, but is correlated with stronger and formal property institutions just generally. Development of the institutions surrounding agriculture, surveying of land, fencing, branding, markets, law of liability for cattle, all these things. And you start to see specialization in trade that begins in the Neolithic period. So that's kind of a summary of what we're going to try to accomplish in, 40 minutes or so. And so let's do that. I'm going to start by talking about some non-economic theories and intuitions for why domestication. So one thing that pops up a lot is that anthropologists in particular talk about Pleistocene climate change that shrinks the habitat for lots of species and likely reduces the gains from hunting. And so if the gains from hunting operating as a hunter-gatherer go down, there's potentially more relative gains from operating as an owner, controller, herder, protector of some meat source, power source, what have you. Domestication is widely viewed out there among non-economists also to be non-intentional. Okay? Aggressiveness in populations or in species is considered an undesirable characteristic. And just to kind of give a precursor here, from an econ perspective, aggressiveness is high cost of control, high enforcement costs. Okay? The docile dog is easier to control than the one that jumps over the fence every time or digs under the fence, and so forth. The famous work by Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel, where he talks about some of this stuff, he basically, like Galton, lays out a bunch of inherent characteristics which he deems to be, requisite for domesticating wild creatures. And in particular, he actually talks about the auroch, what we believe to be the wild, the European, Eurasian cattle, which didn't go extinct actually until about the 16th century. You can find it in art and statues and so forth. So even though we had domesticated cattle back at least 10,000 years ago, the aurochs were still around until relatively recently. And so Diamond says, well, the reason we didn't domesticate bison in the New World is because they were just tougher and meaner and stronger than the auroch. And well, remember, we don't really know what the auroch was like because they've been gone. And to compare bison to Holsteins now is, you're not comparing, it's like comparing wolves to toy poodles. But I'll just show you a picture here. And I can't remember who I talked to that put together the poster. If you'd had been in touch with me, we could have got the auroch on the poster, but we didn't. So that's sort of what we think the auroch, and people are trying to reverse engineer the auroch now by selecting out domestic genes and trying to go back. There's a cattle in Europe called the Heck cattle, which is supposed to be similar, but that's kind of an artist's reconstruction, if you will. And they're a little smaller, nastier horns, probably really fast. You know, bison are known to run as fast as horses and so forth. So it's not obvious at all that you know, this guy was really cuddly, and that's why we created so forth. There's also an idea about mutuality, that wolves and dogs kind of domesticated each other, and I'm not going to talk about that too much, but so there's some theories out there, but there's really no systematic treatment. So this is where econ comes in. This is what we're good at, systematically analyzing stuff. And so let's just start by thinking about the costs and benefits of domestication. And they're pretty obvious, I think. So if you can have domestic animals rather than domestic reindeer instead of chasing caribou all over the landscape, you can have a more stable food source. You may have increased production of shelter and clothing and tools. You can lower the cost of power and transportation. You have horses, you have oxen, and so on and so forth. And more generally, this allows you to potentially engage in greater and greater specialization and ultimately lead to greater wealth. There's a big literature. I'll tie into it a little bit. The hunter-gatherers can often create common property ownership. The Ostrom sort of critique of open access that says that, well, you're not going to just ruin and over-harvest everything. If you have a tight-knit group, you're going to manage and generate some rents, but you'll probably generate those in relative isolation compared to a world in which we're starting to trade. So by the Roman period, we're trading grain all over the Roman Empire, we're trading hides, we're trading wine and other crops, and people are really specialized compared to a hunter-gatherer culture. Of course, there are costs also. The cost of capture and rearing and controlling animals, and I'm not going to talk about plants really today. There's also the opportunity cost of hunting, and this is something kind of intuited by some of those anthropologists. If the hunting's really good or the fishing's really good, well, why bother domesticating something? Okay, it's just relatively more costly. And this cost of confining and controlling is likely to vary across species and across habitat as well. So the same species can behave very differently in different habitats. So the reindeer or the wild reindeer in Europe come in two varieties really, the forest and tundra varieties. And the forest variety is much more skittish, much less social than the tundra variety. It's sort of like white-tailed deer and mule deer, for those of you who are Westerners. You know this difference in their behavior. So that's kind of the basics here, costs and benefits. What do we know about domestication? You probably know nothing, or almost nothing. So let me give you a little bit of information here. There we go. So when does all this happen? It basically happens, 10, 15,000 years ago, or years before present, as we say. And basically what's happened, you get dogs and sheep, goats, cats, cattle, horses, and so forth. The reindeer is relatively recent, a couple thousand years ago. And this mostly happens in Eurasia. We'll look at some maps here. So I want you to think about two kinds of people, really. Hunter-gatherers that hunt and collect from wild populations, and agriculturalists that own, husband, and trade products from these domestic populations. And talk about these. So this is an idea I'm pushing. Again, I can't make any causal claims here. Certainly correlation is clear, but it's worth thinking about because we're talking about domestication from a property rights perspective here. this gives you a little more detail here, and I'll show you another slide or two. So, the dog, Canis lupus familiaris, the wolf, that happens first. And I think there's even more evidence now just recently that it's maybe even older than that and may have happened at different points, at different locations. And then you get in, again, Southwest Asia, this is where everything happens, Iran, Turkey, Syria, and so forth. You get sheep, goats, and pigs, and cattle seem to come around a little bit later. And then you get some other things. There's the chicken. Horse is relatively recent. And so camels, llamas. And notice there's no big mammals in the Americas except for this. Okay, well, dogs. Okay, and here's the reindeer. All right. You can look at it another way. You can look at this little table shows years before present, and then dog comes first by quite a chunk, and then you start to get the sheep, goats, pig, and cattle come a little later. And that's kind of the, almost looks like a, cumulative distribution, if you will, but you can look at that. And here's another map there's a map that shows sort of the some of the site locations. Again, pretty much coming out of Southwest Asia, if you will, Near East, Levant. Different terms are used here and there. So that's where it's all happening. What's the evidence for this? Really three things. One is morphological, physiological changes. I'll go to a link here in a second. So there's evidence. You saw the little toy poodle next to the wolf. So big morphological changes. And you also get behavioral changes. The breeding cycle becomes, okay, so domestic chickens lay eggs all the time. Wild chickens don't do that. It doesn't make sense to lay, if you're a wild chicken in Montana, it makes no sense to lay an egg in January. And so forth. So this is a big difference. There's a lot of data from archaeologists on herd management using kill site data. So they can look at the bones and decide if these things were killed in a corral. The age-sex ratio will be different for kill sites that are more consistent with management and these kind of things. Okay. And then when you start finding the species in its non-native habitat, you start finding the Holsteins, in South America or India, or the pigs here. You get the pack. So there's trading going on here too. We're not going to talk about that, but it's something to think about. Let me just show you summarize for you the morphological changes, which if you think back to those pictures, you will have already talked. A lot of things. The basic idea is that you start to get the retention of juvenile characteristics. And, so the floppy ears and short snouts that dogs have, well, juvenile wolves have those too, but the adult wolves tend not. If you have a good memory and look closely at the reindeer versus the caribou, you saw the same thing basically, and they've measured that stuff. You get a reduction in sexual dimorphism, differences between males and females. They get dumber. Reduction in brain size. I guess that's not the same as being dumber, but there's definitely a reduction in brain size from a dog from a wolf to a dog and so forth. You start to get color variations. Okay, so pink is not an awesome color to have if you're a wild boar, and so on, or that Holstein thing if you're a wild cattle and so on. Then you get the loss of the natural breeding cycle. So there's a lot of big things, and the biologists have even studied there's changes in the hormonal systems and all these things that go with this. So we have that evidence. And I'm not going to talk about the Neolithic package. I think that we'll skip that. All right. So what is domestication in economic terms? I'm going to say that a domesticated animal is distinguished from wild by ownership and the time path of ownership. So you can legally own under certain regulations a wild boar or a wild tiger, but that's not a domesticated animal from a biological sense or even an economic sense. So we want to think of an animal that is owned and also has had a long history of ownership and a long enough history of this ownership and what we'll call economic selection to basically change it morphologically and behaviorally. Okay? Now, when exactly does that occur? The archaeologists, they have a term for something called a domestication event, where they say they're morphologically, behaviorally distinct, but it's not a super clear thing. There are Alaska Huskies that are dogs, okay, and they look pretty close to wolves, and so on. And notice we've had a long, in fact, I was doing some rereading in today, and if the evidence is that those, if you looked at domesticated cattle 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, they're actually quite small. And we have now, we all of us have now created really large cattle sometimes, and we even created large workhorses. So there's even a sometimes we raise cattle for bullfighting. And so that's kind of the next stage of all of this, but that early human prehistory, if you will, with domesticated animals, will have them relatively smaller. But of course, you can start to create very fine-tuned selection processes. Okay, so basically this process is one in which natural selection is sort of largely replaced by what we'll call human selection or economic selection. You ultimately get individuals that are pretty much dependent on human control, sort of less likely or unlikely to survive in nature, if you will. And at this point, the domesticate, we call them, becomes property of the group, or maybe member of the group, if you will. I'm going to go to this next link and think about property rights a little more explicitly. I know some of you had some discussion of property rights in your course, so there we go. So here we're thinking of a situation starting with hunter-gatherers, and they're harvesting, some reindeer or what have you. Wolves are interesting. They were never harvested for meat. So a lot of the domesticates are meat sources and or power sources. Wolves, not meat sources, protection, herding, assistance, some power. And then you get domestication, and there's a couple ways you can go. You can go full on domestication into agriculturalists, where you have private ownership of everything, the animals, the plots, the land, and here you start to get a state, and you get law, and you get organized trade, and you start to get formal property rights, surveys and maps and branding and so on and so forth. Pastoralists they're a little different. They get private ownership of animals, tend to have common ownership of land, and very informal tribal governance, not formal law, not really much of a state. So these were reindeer herders. These are the people who were fishing off the coast, but it's different than this. Okay, I'm not going to say a ton about moving from here to here or here. We're going to kind of skip that. We're going to focus on just the process of getting a domesticated creature, but you can think more generally here. And even more generally, you could probably think of ownership systems or property rights to habitat and the animals. So here I've got habitat ownership regimes across the top and animal populations ownership regimes. Open access means nobody's owning anything. So if you have open access to land, open access to population, that might be your starting point. Simplest hunting situation for wild species. Okay. What seems to have emerged, and this is kind of the way archaeologists, anthropologists, and now economists, Ostrom-style economists anyway, that hunter-gatherers often basically had group control over a population. This is our territory. We kind of defended it. We're the Sioux. We're going to hunt bison in this area of the Dakotas or Montana, and we kind of control that population, and we kind of control the land in kind of an informal common property kind of way. That is kind of the way we're thinking as our starting point here. Pastoralists now with domestic animals, so the reindeer hunters, the reindeer herders in what's now Norway are like this. They've got private domestic reindeer but common ownership of land. The caribou hunters in North America, they haven't domesticated the reindeer there, the caribou, but they kind of control the population and control the habitat as a group, if you will. Our modern world, the one we're in basically, is down here. We've got private land, and private ownership of the animals as well. So cattle on a ranch, private cattle, private land. Okay, there's some other options here. So keep that in mind. We're kind of thinking about moving from here to here, basically. All right. Okay, so what's an economic, excuse me, what's the process here? I want to think about it in kind of 6 stages here, if you will, and then we'll kind of go into the details. I know some of you have taken some natural resource economics from Professor Steele, so I'm going to bring that back to you a little bit with our kind of a fishery harvest model, except we'll think of caribou or bison or something like that. So let's just think about it this way. We're starting in our model with a, where did it go? There it is. Harvesting a wild population. So remember a picture like this, some of you? So down here we've got some economic choice effort, hunting effort, if you will. We've got some benefits and costs in dollars. Obviously there's no dollars 10, 15,000 years ago, but some numeraire. And we've got this forward bending total revenue function that comes out of the biology, because that's our product. And we've got some costs, some constant marginal cost. And if you have open access, you get too much effort, and you can draw down the stock really low. We talked about that. You might even extinguish it possibly. We talked about that at our, we're calling it pre-dinner, I guess? Pre-dinner. Sure. But here's the thing. If you control the territory and the population, maybe as a group, you get the optimal level of effort, you get the rent. And so the idea is you're humming along here, we're our common property group, and we're getting rent from the bison or the caribou. That's our starting point. And so if we're going to domesticate, we got to do at least as good as that. Okay, so that's our starting point. I'll just skip ahead. Some of you remember where this comes from. So there's our biological growth function. Okay, carrying capacity and all that stuff. That's just for the insiders here to think about. Okay, so let's go back here. So we're starting with that. Our hunter-gatherer group is optimally harvesting a wild population. They're getting some rent from it. And we're not going to worry about the internal dynamics of the group. Is there a chief? Is it a patrilineal society or not? And all that stuff. We're kind of assuming the group is just like a firm, a black box for the moment. Firm before Coast taught us to think about the firm. And then there's some innovation in hunting strategies here. Now we can figure out how to confine some animals. We know how to do it. We know how to catch a wolf or catch a wild caribou or something like this. It may be that, in fact, probably the best way to think about this, it may be getting the dog first is a good move. Because then the dog can be the technology, if you will. So we know that dogs came before all those other creatures. At least that's but I guess the question is, do we really know it? Because the archaeology data is moving around, but that seems to be pretty clear. Dogs first, well in advance, and so forth. All right. The big innovation here in sort of the analysis is understanding that there's a distribution of characteristics within a species or a population. Some are nasty, some aren't. Okay? Not every wild wolf is really nasty or as nasty as the one next to it. And so we imagine a distribution of characteristics over aggressiveness. Okay? And basically the idea is that confinement cost is going to be lower for docile compared to aggressive animals. And this is a little bit different than the Diamond-Galton idea. They were saying, well, this species is docile, this species is aggressive. We're saying no, there's a distribution of aggressiveness within a species, and it's going to be cheaper to grab the nice ones, take care of the nice ones, catch them, maintain them, keep them in the pen, and so forth. In the long run, only docile animals are kept in the herd. And aggressive ones are slaughtered. Now, it turns out, and I'll talk about this fox experiment in a minute, it turns out docile animals, they tend to have all these characteristics like the juvenile characteristics, and they tend to pass those on. Okay. And domestication is not the explicit goal in our model. But I'm going to divert now to a case where it is. Does anybody know about this stuff? Anybody heard of this? Yeah. So, and we had one of the authors. So this book, How to Tame a Fox, fascinating book about this 50-year experiment started in the Soviet Union by a Soviet scientist who basically wanted to figure out what is going on with domestication. He was able to use, with permission from the authorities, subjects from Soviet silver fox farms, which were used for fur and were quite valuable as a source of revenue. And his main assistant was this young student, Ludmila Trut, who I think is still alive, but she's 80-something. And the co-author is Lee Dugatkin, who's an evolutionary biologist at the University of Louisville, just down the street from Bloomington. He came up and talked about this book when it came out. Basically what they did, the intuition was, let's just, when we have a litter of fox pups, let's just kind of play with them and see which ones are nice to us. And then let's just let them breed separately, okay? And so they started doing that, and they realized, and some were very nice to humans, and some were, this went for your face and your neck immediately. And so ultimately they get a more sort of systematic protocol of characteristics they're looking for, but basically it is friendliness, niceness, docility, and then letting those breed, and then the next one, and so forth. And not much happened those first few generations, but things started to kick in after 20 years. All sorts of things. You started to get the floppy ears, early sexual maturity, all the neoteny. Some of them even lost the breeding cycle, the natural breeding cycle. This is in 50 years or so. And apparently some of these silver fox pups are really very dog-like, with one interesting exception. Said they really stink, at least to the human nose. I'm expecting by now dog smell is pretty good for humans. I don't know what dog smell was like 10,000 years ago or 12,000 years ago, but this is pretty. But this was our goal, is to try to see if this will do it, and it had very good intuitive economic appeal, because they're basically, the nice ones are going to be easy to take care of. They're going to have low enforcement costs, low maintenance costs, et cetera, and that's basically the way we think about this. So this is a fascinating story, and there's a lot of interesting political economy in there as well, because this guy had Dmitry Belayev, he had to do a lot of work because the Soviets didn't care about this, but he had to do a lot of things to keep favor with the authorities so he could keep his experiment going. And that's in the book, and you may want to, but I recommend that as a kind of mystery. So in general, in our model, it's not the goal, but here, in this case, notice this is a really long experiment to keep going. I don't know of anything like that in the US, really. And so it was because of that Soviet system, essentially, that you could kind of keep something going like this. So the domestication event is one in which the population is converted in our model to 100% docile. All right. So we're not going to go deep into the model here, but we'll get a little feel for it and set up for some discussion. So the model has the following characteristics. We start with this hunter-gatherer. They're hunting the wild population. They're generating rent because they keep out the outsiders. And we might think about this. Maybe this is a question to come to after we're done. What if the group is hunting but couldn't exclusively control a hunting area and a population? How would that change our domestication process? So we have this underlying renewable resource model, and we've got some population dynamics. We've got aggressive and docile types, okay? But since they're wild, they're mostly aggressive, okay? And we're not going to deal with the distribution, just two types. It turns out, based on that biology from the fox study and others, that these docile types are strongly correlated with a different genotype, and so forth. So in our model, the aggressive are going to be killed first. You want to get rid of those, not husband them, okay? Which is basically what happened in the fox experiment. The mean ones were just sent off to the furrier, basically. And then over time, the confined population is going to be completely docile. Let me just set up the model for some of you, especially the math econ people and so forth, get a feel for what this might look like. So we're going to assume our group, our hunter-gatherer group, facing a population that has some aggressive, some A's, and some D's, is going to basically try to maximize the rent by choosing the share of docile and aggressive that are slaughtered in the system. So it's a very simple model. We're not investing in fences and corrals and that stuff yet. We have no dogs here, so this model makes more sense for cattle or sheep rather than dogs because we're not really harvesting. The dog model is something we're still thinking about here. And so we're picking the share of the aggressive and docile. So what the model looks like in math is the following. We're going to maximize the rent, and this is right here. This is the share of the aggressive times how many aggressive plus the share of docile times how many docile that you kill minus the cost of confinement. And there's no cost of confinement for the docile. We're just assuming that's 0, and so there's a differential cost. So that's the cost of doing this. You pick the share of the two, subject to this constraint. And this constraint just says add up all the aggressive, add up all the docile, and they're no greater than what you could have harvested in the wild population, the optimal harvest level. Okay? So, this generates some optimal shares, and then it generates a time path of what the share of A's and T's look like over time. And I'll show you some pictures in a second, but we get these implications. So, a population that's a lot more aggressive, it'll take longer to domesticate. Some of this is not super surprising. It is increasing in the share of the population that's confined and decreasing in the proportion of the animals that are slaughtered, if you will. So I'm going to go back to show you these pictures here at the end of this setting. So we can, once we solve for the dynamics of optimal share of slaughtered, optimal share of domestic, we can look at how that path evolves over time for different parameter values. We've just got a couple. I'll show you a couple of those. And we're basically going to see, now our model, you might be thinking, what's the time period of the model? Well, a little fuzzy. In that Fox experiment, it was 1 year. We're kind of, it's a little bit vague. How do you want to model this well-knit, ethnically homogeneous group of people that manages bison or caribou or something like that? Is one period a week? Is it a month? Is it the generation of the group? We're pretty vague here, but it's ultimately something we'll want to think about a little bit more. But let's look at these figures here. So this just shows the proportion over time of aggressive animals in a population. So you start with one, nearly 1. So I'd have to look back at what our, we're looking at these little simulations, if you will, with very high populations of aggressive. So it's just a few that are nice. And that's in the case of the Fox experiments, they were mostly not nice. It wasn't every litter you get 5 nice ones out of 7. That's not how it was. It was one nice one every, I have to look back at the, it's a relatively small proportion, under 10% or something like that. And this shows what happens. Well, initially, the proportion falls, but then it falls quite rapidly. And then at some point, you just get to no aggressive, and then they're gone. They're out, okay? You can look at it the following way, too. You can look at it, the time to domestication, the number of periods, which, again, we haven't really defined here. What do we think it is? In the case of cattle, remember, we think about the data from archaeological studies. They've got a site that we think is 12,000 years ago. In other words, 14, a lot of missing information in there, so we don't really know. But you start to find evidence, by, when they say cattle were domesticated at 10,000 years, they mean they found evidence at year 10,000 of kill site. Sort of, it's like a. I actually don't know exactly how they agree to it. People make various claims, and that's kind of what the literature says. This is when we find kill sites where we're killing the old and not the old males, basically. That's what happens when you domesticate. You get rid of the old males fast because they are the nastiest ones. And I say this in class with undergraduates, and they go, yeah, get it. The old males, we want to get rid of them. That's what the deans say about faculty, too. So anyways, this is what happens. You start out with share of aggressive and then it, excuse me, if the share of aggressive is very low, or excuse me, pretty, what do we got here? Time to domesticate function of share of aggressive. As the share of the aggressive goes up, it takes longer to get the full domestication packages. Now, I don't know if we could ever really get a good empirical sense of what the share of aggressive is in a wild population. And we don't, so we know 10,000 years ago, the archaeologists tell us we have domestic cattle. Do we know when they first tried to domesticate cattle? Was it 12,000 years ago? Was it 14? I don't know. So that's what there's a lot of thinking about empirical work here with lots of missing stuff and so on. Oops, I'm going to skip that. We'll go back here because aren't we just about out of time? Yeah, about 10 minutes. Okay, well, it should be in pretty good shape. So that's sort of the model that we develop here, and it generates these predictions and ways to think about it. And what I'll do next is talk about some applications and extensions. And one of the things I want to talk about is a modern application to the American bison, which it turns out by law in almost all states is governed as domestic animals or private property, not wild like deer. And this has some implications, and it's an issue out there among conservationists as well. Okay, so let's just talk about a few of these things, some extensions. So these maybe shouldn't be under here, but the dog and cattle, Gustavo and I are thinking of a wolf model and a wolf dog model and an Auric cattle model is kind of different features. You can think of these as kind of Auric cattle is like sheep and pigs and goats and so forth. You know, a meat source, quadruped, and so forth. And you know, we're thinking of the dog as kind of becomes the enforcement technology. Okay, it's once you have the dog, you now can herd and cull and so forth and control these animals. I spent a few days with reindeer herders in Norway, and it was pretty amazing to watch them with a whistle and a dog control a herd of reindeer. And it's clear what the reindeer were thinking. These dogs are basically wolves, and they're nipping at my heels. I want to get away from them. And that's exactly, but they don't actually take them, you know, a real wolf would take them down, right? Those are the wolves you don't want, right? The ones that are still wolves. And so the wolf to dog domestication is, well, you're selecting, our harvest model is not going to work there. It's going to be a different model, and we've started to develop that a little bit. But you want some to protect. Some are dangerous to you, and some aren't. So it's a little different selection problem here. One thing I haven't mentioned at all, and you should be thinking about this, when are you going to exercise the control? Are you do it when they're adults or juveniles? Are you going to take a group of them or just one at a time? Because these are all social animals, which is in some sense to the advantage. So maybe you take a group and it sticks together if you get them separate from the other group. We do have evidence from the history of bison in Great Plains of a very famous case where a Flathead Indian hunter came off a buffalo hunt in the 1860s and had 4 or 5 bison calves after the rest were killed, followed them back or herded them back with horses to what was a new reservation. And then he just kind of let them go, and there was no one out there. And 20 years later, he's got a herd of 300 or so, which became a herd that ultimately was used to replenish bison population in a Canadian national park after the U.S. government couldn't make the deal. So that suggests, wow, 3 or 4 or 5, you can get a population, and that it was. And people talk about this. It can be easier to capture juveniles rather than adults, but I don't know if the archaeologists don't comment on this as far as we can tell at this point. Once you own these animals, what are you going to do about K here? Are you going to exert ownership over the land, which is a way of thinking about the carrying capacity? Another question is, well, when does or not the wild ancestor get extirpated? So what about the wolf and the dog? We got a lot of dogs in this world. And you might think, well, there's almost no wolves left. Well, there are a lot of wolves left in Russia and Canada and Alaska, and there's not that many in the lower 48, but there's more, and that's an endangered species issue and so forth. So on the one hand, we've killed off a lot of wolves, there's no doubt about it, and we've also made them into dogs. The auroch lasts for, millennia and was finally extinguished a few hundred years ago. Wild sheep is still around. Wild boar all over Europe. That's the ancestor. The wild horse, original wild horse, is some debate about whether there's something in Mongolia that was really the wild horse ancestor. And so notice what happened. If you start domesticating a lot of cattle and need land for cattle, you're going to have less habitat for the wild, potentially. And so it kind of links into conservation as well. What's the spatial and temporal variation of this stuff? And what happens if you start with open access? So let's imagine we go back to that fishery model where you're not able to control the territory for the caribou or the bison, so you're dissipating the rent. You're not really getting anything out of it, you're just covering your opportunity cost. There's no rent to the resource. Is that situation going to be better or worse for the prospect of domestication? Well, one intuition says it's actually better because there's even more gains from if you're in open access world hunting, there's more gains from domesticating than there would be if you're already generating some rent. So we kind of expect to make it real clear. We kind of expect, the guys who were really in a great hunting area and had control of the territory, they're going to be the last guys to domesticate. They're just going to sit there and be happy hunter-gatherers. It's the other areas where you're likely to get, where the open access is more likely, where you have more incentive to domesticate. Let's just talk about this just briefly. We have how much time now? Almost nothing, right?
Yeah, 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Let's skip to bison. Okay, so as I mentioned, very briefly, interesting modern application of something Gustavo and I are working on is the following situation. So I'm sure you know the story. Basically, the bison were basically wiped out, down to about 1,000 individuals by 1890 or so. 1,000 individuals almost counted one by one. In 1890 or so in North America. And what that meant, simultaneously we're getting wildlife law established and early wildlife agencies to handle deer and geese and so on and so forth. And we're getting a new law of wildlife, basically because there were no bison anywhere, or almost nowhere. The states just either ignored them or just considered them to be domestic animals like cattle. Okay? In fact, you can look at the state statutes, and that's basically what they are considered to be. Now, Yellowstone Park is a big exception, but they're basically considered to be cattle almost all over the place. And that allows private ownership, carries liability, and so you can buy and sell these things. In fact, except for Yellowstone Park, these animals were bought and sold to replenish what now became parks. Then in the 70s, you start to get this market emerge for bison meat. Ted Turner was in on it, as you may know. He owns a lot of bison land. And you start to get bison markets. They are now even in the U.S. Census of Agriculture. The census takers ask how many bison you have, as well as how many horses and cattle and how much wheat you grow. And private conservationists have actually been in this market. There's a group that's trying to establish a large kind of a nature preserve in north central Montana. They went out and bought bison in the market and to expand a herd. You could not do that with deer. Okay, so there's incentives here for private conservation and so forth. At the same time, because you've got liability and these animals are big and they have diseases as well, we expect economic selection to be present as well. In fact, this is the big concern of the conservation community, that we're changing the bison. And we are. Now, we're not changing it as intensively, I don't think, as those silver foxes were changed. But they're fenced. They have to be fenced. Okay? You just can't let them go from Kansas to North Dakota. Okay? They have to be vaccinated and so on. And so this is a concern here now. So there, this gets at all sorts of interesting issues. And we've collected a little data. So what you find when you get the private herds, you get a very different male-female ratio than a natural herd. You get way fewer males, you get less old males, and so forth. And you get different levels of intensive management depending on whether you're kind of in proximity to urban areas and things like this. So that's a project that we're looking at. And this is a big issue generally in wildlife conservation. To what extent should you let private market forces into the system? It has its upside, good incentives, but it also has this economic selection component. And if you're a biological purist, like a lot of biologists are, they want bison, roaming from Manitoba to Texas the way they used to. Now that's, a little hard to imagine that. But if you don't let them do that, there'll be different bison. How different will they be? That's kind of a question. So I'm going to stop there. That's a pretty good time. Thank you.
And we have time for a couple of questions.
Yes.
I have one question. I noticed that when you were talking about innovations that led to domestication, you talked about innovations in the gathering. But what about like barbed wire, the innovations in the ability to contain?
Well, that would be, of course, much later. But I think the idea of corrals, when I work with those, so we find all these hunting sites which are basically funnels, rock cairns, when they ran bison off cliffs, and then if you have wood, you can make a little fence and stuff and narrow them down. You get them crowded in the kill sites. It doesn't take much imagination to turn a funnel fence into a corral. Just you cap it off, and it's now a corral, and then add a barn. So so the archaeologists they have documented when barns and fences emerge, and so barbed wire is much later, obviously, but it's a change in technology and confinement that allows ownership on that particular landscape. When I spent a couple of days with these reindeer herders, they had a funnel. Remember, reindeer haven't been domesticated that long, a couple thousand years, so they're still a little more wild than cattle, and they had this wide fence that funneled in, and then it kind of curved. It kind of was like what's the term? It's like a spiral in to the corral. You wouldn't need that with cattle. Cattle are so used to being moved. They just cowboys use four-wheelers now because they're not chasing them all over. They just kind of go where they need to go. When there's a park called Wichita Mountain National Refuge in western Oklahoma, and they have longhorn cattle, which were feral domestic cattle. So they were feral for a couple hundred years, but they were been domesticated for 10,000. And they're on that same park with bison. And they round them up every year, both of them, and they need helicopters and giant team of people to round up the bison. These once feral but long domesticated longhorns can be rounded up very easily. And people have done, there are actually wild reindeer in Norway as well as domestic reindeer, and there are feral reindeer, once domesticated but now wild. And the biologists have done the studies of flight-fight response is very different from the pure wild the never domestic to the once domestic to the currently domestic. So these technologies, it gives you a feel for what the technologies might be. And of course, it's hard to know exactly, at least as far as what we know at this point. But the barbed wire is a modern technology that fits that perfectly. Although by then that barbed wire wasn't good enough for the bison. It was good enough for the domestic cattle on the plains, and so forth. Yeah. Other?
I wanted to get a student to...
Yeah, all these old male members of the species.
Quick statement and a question.
Yeah.
So, sometime in the last 20 years, I've tried to do a quick check on my phone, but it didn't get keyword right. PBS Nova did a special on the silver fox, and they had a lot, they showed exactly.
Oh, did they?
what
Okay.
happened, but I don't remember.
Okay.
The last 20 years. The other thing is, here in Michigan, they actually have a big problem with feral pigs. It doesn't take but a couple generations for pigs to start growing tusks again.
Yeah.
And there've been some breeds of pigs that even though they're not feral, they don't let farmers
Yeah.
raise anymore.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that at all?
I can talk a little bit. I mean, I think what's happening with the feral, so there's always that term going feral. And so what's going to happen is there's going to be, they're out there in the wild, you're not under control anymore, so that some are going to pop up with some tusks.
Well, they escape, so they
Right, no, I understand that. But now they're out there living on their own, and the nastier ones are going to do better, and they're going to out-survive the nice ones out in the wild.
not far from here, only 50 miles.
Right, but so they are going to be, they are going to get wilder than the domestic because of selection also. There's different selection pressures once they leave. Feral dogs they can be a livestock problem also. Yeah, so there's a lot of, so the basic message here of this economic selection versus natural selection, it's still there, and it's just, in the setting we're thinking about, it's pretty intensive. You're capturing them, you're monitoring them closely. But even if you're just changing land use or even hunting regulation, if you change if you change the rules about males, females, stuff like that, you can start to shape the population, even if it's sort of still technically legally wild. And so that basic message is.
And the fishing industry that does
Yep.
stuff along the coast, that can be a real
Sure,
mess if they
sure.
get out in the wild.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But again, legally, they would be unowned at some point. So they can, they're managed by wildlife agencies and so forth, yeah. Anything else?
One more question.
Yeah, you got it.
This is slightly less economic-y and more of
Oh,
like,
no.
what's your opinion on it. But with certain dogs like pugs that like can't breathe because they've been like genetically bred, people are starting to like genetically breed them the other way.
Mhm.
So like, are there economic implications of that as well?
Well, the value of pugs that can breathe higher than the value of ones that probably, the pet owners, yeah. But, I mean, dogs are so special. You go back a few hundred years and dogs are they're not that, the range of variation. A lot of these modern breeds are relatively recent. So if you just go dwarf, pink skin, you're going to get something interesting fairly shortly. Yeah, I'm sure that there are probably a lot of these unexpected health problems or behavioral problems from selective breeding of various kinds, yeah, in pets and so forth.
Did you only use animals that would be used for anything but pets in your data?
This is ancient econ, so we're just trying to focus on that group I mentioned, chickens, turkeys. We're probably focusing mostly on the big mammals right here, dogs, reindeer, and so forth. And there's a lot of other stuff out there, and you could make a longer list. Guinea pigs, I don't know, maybe, and so on and so forth. But we haven't, something's got to give here for a project, yeah.
All right. Let's give another hand to Dean.